If you want to change your life, change your habits. I'm Shireen Skeepers, founder of For Your Life and host of this podcast dedicated to exploring and understanding the power of habits. Join me as I speak with experts and everyday people who have transformed their lives through the power of habit. Because this is for your life. This is about habits and it's about time. Your time starts now.
There's quite a bit of work that's embedded in trying to change the habit. And what I often tell people is that you can't focus on the behavior to change the behavior.
From living with gangs in the projects of New York to developing programs that help lawyers deal with depression and anxiety, forensic psychologist Dr. Qusai Hussain has dedicated his life to understanding why people do what they do. In this episode, I talk with Dr. Q about habits for good mental health, those seemingly unimportant decisions that can have a significant impact on your life. We touch on addiction, anxiety, depression, and loneliness. You may even get some tips on overcoming procrastination or even how to stop automatic negative thoughts. Thanks for coming in today, Dr. Q. Very exciting to have a chat with you today. I've known you for a few years and I've always known you as a doctor of forensic psychology. And in preparing for our interview today, I did a little online stalking and did a little more research on you to find I was very surprised to discover all these very interesting things about your background. So you obviously grew up in India and you got a law degree specializing in criminal defense law. I didn't know that. And then you found your way over to New York, where you got your master's in forensic psychology. And then you landed up in Melbourne, where you got your doctorate. So I'm very interested into how that sort of pathway unfolded and how you found yourself in Melbourne.
Yeah, thank you, Shireen. Yeah, we've known each other for quite a while now. So it's been really interesting to get to this position now and, come onto your podcast. So thank you very much for inviting me over to talk about habits. Well, my journey started with law. So I did my law degree in India in National Law School of India University. And I was very interested in criminal behavior, even back then while I was doing my law. I got a little bit disillusioned with the legal system and the legal structure. So I was doing criminal defense work and I felt like a doorman really at a revolving door. People would come in, I'd get them out, they'd be back in again. And, so it was just this revolving door kind of scenario. And so I figured, there had to be a better way. And so I did a bit of research and started to look around to see how I could combine law with my passion, which was always psychology. So the mind and how people behave and why they do what they do was always an interesting aspect for me. And so I wanted to combine that. And so I then found this amazing master's degree in New York, which was one of the first of its kind at the time in forensic psychology. And so that allowed me to combine both my legal background and psychology as well. And so that was a great experience working in America and in New York, studying and working. And then once I finished that, I then applied to do my doctorate and applied to Melbourne. I applied to a number of other universities, but Melbourne more specifically because the professor that I wanted to study under was at Melbourne University, and he was the preeminent professor in the field of sex offending. And that's what I specialized in, working with sex offenders in my doctoral thesis.
Fascinating. And I think at the time that I met you, you were doing that work, and I read about your background that not only have you worked in prisons, but you've worked across a variety of other sectors. So in organizations, you've worked with corporates, you've worked with community, with higher education. I'm quite interested, though, in your experience in working with prisons and people up for parole, etc. What have been your observations around that?
Well, working with offenders, obviously, it's a very different clientele that you've got, And it's interesting because I've worked with offenders now across a number of different continents across the world, including India. And America, it's very different. Working within the prison system itself it's a really hardcore system working in the prison system. So the types of offenders that you get, just even morphologically, when you look at, the Americans, they're just bigger, the way that they speak, it's, quite different. It's a lot more brash. And so within that prison system, it's a lot more intimidating when you're actually working with them. I also worked with gangs as part of a project while I was working there. And then we did some ethnographic research with gangs, which is effectively living with the gangs. And so I lived in the projects in New York while doing this study. And it was really amazing to just be part of that. Because, when you talk about sort of, habits and, mental health and offending behavior and crime, all of those are linked into kind of, your contextual background to a large extent.
So, Dr. Q, people go to extreme lengths to understand their subject choice or what they are studying, but living with gangs, this is very extreme. So did you feel safe? Did they know who you were? How did you do that?
Yeah, so that work was really a function of the time that I spent in New York, and it's what we call, ethnographic research, and part of that ethnographic research is to be embedded in the environment in which you are and to just simply observe. So you're not really meant to engage, you're not meant to disrupt, you don't want to do anything to alter the course of what's actually going on, you're just there to observe what is happening. And so the work that I was actually doing was related to a professor who was actually writing a book at the time on a particular gang in New York, which were moving from their sort of more criminal activity to a more political organization. So they were trying to kind of change their image and the way that they were operating. And so he'd been working for a long time. I was a research assistant at the time. And so as part of that work, in terms of writing this book, I was invited to be part of it. And so that's where I then also had the opportunity to live in, the projects there in New York and observe all these different things that, I was talking about earlier. And the environment in which you were in can be and is actually quite scary because, things could happen at any point. However, because of sort of the way in which I was sort of operating there, confidentiality, etc., I was not able to kind of see. I was taken away from different places, etc., when anything was going to happen. And so I didn't really observe any criminal activity, but what I was able to observe was the environment in which these people live and, the children grow up, because these people then have families, right? So they've got partners, they have wives, they've got children, they have mortgages. So they're living kind of, fairly normal lives in that sense as well, but they're also involved in other types of, activities to facilitate their kind of lifestyle. But, so in that environment itself, you then get, these children who grow up and observe these particular types of behaviors. And, in psychology, we call it modeling, because you don't have to actually say anything or tell anyone anything. You actually just observe the behavior, and then you model that behavior because you're just observing it and you see it, day in and day out. And so that's why it's not hard to see why when children grow up in these particular types of environments, they become highly entrenched with certain types of behaviors, which, they've effectively internalized from the environment in which they live.
Okay. How fascinating. Good God.
Yeah.
Did you, living there, did you feel like that environment was impacting you, or were you able to distance yourself?
No, it does. Yeah, it does impact you. Like sort of the environment I was in, the projects, you would hear sirens going off, almost every 5 or 10 minutes. There would be the police, ambulance, fire engine, etc. There would be random gunshots that would go off during the day, evening, etc. So it's a very, scary environment because you're hypersensitive to things that are actually going on. Like if you walked into the parks there, you could find, hypodermic needles lying around, condoms. So these are parks where the kids play, right? So it's just that type of environment that's kind of, in your face all the time. That's what you're growing up with. And then a lot of these children, as a result of that, become actually fairly desensitized.
That is alarming.
Right?
Yeah.
Because that's what they're seeing day in and day out. So it's
they
kind
don't
of,
it's different.
normalized.
Yeah.
I worked actually in one project that I was doing. This was with Columbia University. And it was called the 911 project. So 911 in America is the emergency line. But that project it was a public school which happened to be called 911, P911. Now, in that school, what they were running was a program for teenage moms. So these were moms who were basically, 13, 14-year-old girls who had children, right, who had a baby. So the point of that study was to first set up the school and give these kids access to the school. They had a creche in the school so that they could bring their babies there, and then they were taught how to look after the child, cook, clean, all of that for the child, as well as do their study. So that was the whole purpose of that program. But the really amazing thing was that in the very first session, I was doing sort of, roll call and, writing all the names of the people, the participants. We had to write the mother's name. And we had to write the child's name and the mother's name. And I was writing it down. And so then I had this lady come up and I was asking her and she said, she gave me a name. I said, oh, no, I need the mother's name. And she said, I am the mother. And so it turned out, because she was pretty young. She might have been about 26 or something. So she was the mother of the teenage mom who was enrolled in the program, who was 13, who had a child.
Wow. Right? So there you go. It's so environmental,
and it was interesting because they were in that sort of, we had these group sessions and stuff like that. And then in that group session, one of the questions that was asked of the mom, why did you, so this was a 13-year-old, why did you, have this child? Why did you decide to have this child? And she was like, well, my mom did it. And, she raised me and I'm fine. And so I figured I could do the same. Yeah, exactly.
Goodness. Yeah. So difficult for people in that environment to pull themselves out when they don't see a different or an alternative example.
Yeah, because that's normalized for them, right? So that's what happened for her. She just thought that's kind of, this is normal. My mom did it, whatever she was doing to raise her, and felt like that was all right. And so, her decision was to then keep the child and raise the child as a result of that. And that's what I mean. That's what I mean by sort of things that are internalized. You then develop certain kinds of views or belief systems as a result of the environment in which you grew up, which then shapes your pattern of behavior and the choices that you make. And being in the projects themselves was really eye-opening to be able to see kind of how young people actually go through life in these environments. And then, of course, develop certain habits just because of the kind of context in which they're living. And so it's not hard to see why people will eventually go into a life of crime when you're living in these particular types of environments, because there were high levels of violence. There was drugs, alcohol in parks, essentially, where kids would come to play, prostitution. So there was a lot going on, which these children then are exposed to very early on in life. And so it's very easy to see how kind of it becomes difficult for them to be able to get out of that cycle once they're already embedded so deeply and grow up contextually in that environment.
Yeah, what is that old adage? You can't be what you can't see. Mm-hmm. So it's, very self-reinforcing, isn't it?
Yeah.
So where did you go to from there?
So then I worked in New York for a while. And so then I was working in the prisons. I was working with the gangs. I had also been working with an organization where we were doing research and evaluation of different sex offender programs in New York. And then also in the maximum security hospital with a ward called Bellevue Hospital in New York. And so after I finished that, I then started to look around to do my doctorate. And the World Trade Center happened at the time I was there. And so then I was kind of looking at, whether I continue to stay in New York or in America or move. And that's when I found Melbourne University and, the professor that I eventually studied under to do my PhD, and specializing then specifically with sex offenders.
So you moved across to Melbourne. At that stage, did you have any intention of staying here and setting up a practice, or did that just evolve over time?
Yeah, I mean, look, I really came here to study. The long-term plan was eventually to continue because you have to get licensed. And so, I had come from India. So the plan was after I completed my doctorate that I would get licensed and then I would continue to practice here. So the plan was to stay. I'd never been to Australia before. And so when I got here, and especially to Melbourne, I really fell in love with the city as soon as I got here. So I was more than happy to continue to live here.
It's very similar to my experience, actually, having come here many years ago. I thought I would just be here for a couple of years, and 20 years later, here I am.
That's right. Yeah.
And I read also in your background that you've also had some extensive experience working with corporates. So what was the nature of that work?
So the corporates, a lot of that work really happened here in Australia, and that opened up a practice, Legal, back in about 2009. And what was happening was that I was then getting a lot of referrals from doctors to my practice, essentially, of lawyers. And really the reasoning was that, well, you're a lawyer, so you probably know how it all works with them. And so I would get all these lawyers.
Yeah.
I would get all these lawyers coming to me. And what the research suggests is that the legal profession has probably one of the highest levels of anxiety and depression and mental health conditions for a variety of different reasons, and probably linked to a number of different habits as well that people have and the way that they sort of operate. But so what happened was, as a result of that, I became really interested to understand why this was the case. Why lawyers? What was it going on with them, people within the legal profession? And there are particular traits that they have which are embedded, very earlier on in terms of their personality style, but then reinforced through university as a result of their legal education, which then transforms into the way that they start to operate in practice. So what happened was, as a result of that, I then started to do quite a bit of research, and so I developed programs for the legal profession to work with them and to better help and understand how to manage their mental health conditions. So that then started to involve into a lot of work within the corporates for different sort of cohorts. And it really started with the legal profession.
Fascinating. And you were described as saying that at some point you started to realize that the mental health system was broken and it wasn't really providing the service, or it was difficult to gain access to the service.
Yeah, so that was really a result of obviously a number of years of practice. And look, there have been a variety of different sort of inquiries into mental health issues, royal commissions, etc. And all of them come back. And really the fundamental issue that the majority of the people have is getting access to quality care. That's really the number one problem reported by most people. And so the big issue for most people is really, how do you find the right practitioner and then get the right type of care as a result of that? Because with mental health and especially, psychology, it's very personal. When you're seeing someone, it's a very personal kind of interaction. You're talking to someone and telling them things that you probably haven't told a lot of people. There are, heightened levels of vulnerability as a result of those types of disclosures. And so there has to be a higher level of trust and engagement. And so if that doesn't really exist, then it makes it very difficult to actually have good therapy and to be able to embed good behaviors, habits, etc., to actually improve your mental health conditions.
It's really interesting. So then you started Cyberlink, and it was really with that sort of in mind that you wanted to find a better way, and you realizing the importance of matching right patient with correct therapist. And so you started Cyberlink in 2017. And how did you address that issue of better matching patient with therapist?
So I started out, 2017 with Cyberlink, and really the objective of that was to provide online mental health care. Now that was, way ahead of our time. Obviously now since COVID, it's become, fundamental way of actually providing some kind of service. But back then it was not really, a go-to. So there wasn't a lot of acceptance around it. But the fundamental premise of that service was that what you do is you take away the geographical boundaries that become limiting in terms of getting access to quality care. So right now, the model has always been that you go and see someone that you see your GP who refers to someone in their local area that they know, that they referred to for a while. You go within your local area. And so you see someone because you've been referred there, or someone has told you, a friend, etc., has referred and, recommended. So you go and see them. What I think a lot of people don't realize is that psychologists are actually specialists. They're not generalists. right? So all psychologists will specialize in particular areas of interest and then develop a level of competence in those particular areas. So the problem in the current model is that what happens is that when you do get a referral, you then are referred to someone who the expectation is that they will treat the condition, and they may not because they're specialized, right? And so with Cyberclinic, what we tried to do, while the whole thing is online and video, face-to-face consults, which I think is very important, the idea behind it is that you're then also matched based on the relevance of your condition and the skill set of the practitioner, but also other underlying factors that we know improve good relationships with the practitioner. So we know from clinical research that if you have a good relationship with your practitioner, it increases outcomes 250%.
That's
irrespective of anything
That's
else.
staggering, 250%.
Irrespective of anything, irrespective of your modality or the way that you're delivering treatment, etc. Right? And so what you really want to do is find a fit, the right fit. And so that's what we designed and developed the AI system around to be able to get that good fit. But apart from getting the good fit, what you also then need is the availability of people, right? So what you really want is, let's say you've got an eating disorder and the best person to treat you, if you're based in Melbourne, is in Hobart, then you shouldn't be restricted from actually seeing that person in Hobart, right? And currently, if you actually think about it, psychology, mental health therapy as a modality is probably, out of all kind of conditions, medical conditions, is probably the best suited for an online modality, especially video.
Because you're not looking at physical symptoms, you're talking about thoughts. Yeah.
That's right, because you're just talking to the person, right?
Yeah.
So essentially that's what will lend itself to, improving the therapeutic outcomes that you're looking for. And you don't need other things. You don't need to be testing and doing things or taking bloods, etc., like doctors have to do.
So that was 2017 when you started Cyberclinic. So you were pioneering this new technology to match clients with, or patients with therapists. And then right time and place, COVID hits, and you have this infrastructure set up and this capability set up. COVID hits, we're all in lockdown, and off you go. How did your practice take off from there?
Well, that's what a lot of people think. Off we went, and it was
Rainbows
fun.
and
Yeah,
unicorns.
that's right. That's what people think. It wasn't really like that when COVID hit. So what happened was, when COVID hit, one of the big issues with the rebate system at the time is that when we designed the platform in the early days, I really designed it as a B2B model. So we were going out to corporate. So that was back, again, it related to sort of my corporate history, going back out, providing it to corporates. And the reason for that was because there was no item number that allowed people to get a rebate from the government for online services. Okay. It didn't exist. So you could go and see a psychologist face-to-face, and you would then get the Medicare rebate, but you wouldn't get it if you actually saw someone online. That only got introduced when COVID hit. That's when the government introduced it. So our entire model had to be built in a B2B model because people wouldn't otherwise access the service. So then when COVID hit, that's when we started to build out the whole B2C side, go to direct to consumer. But as part of that, what we had to do was we had to build out our entire integration with Medicare so that the rebates could occur. And so we are now the only mental health platform in Australia to have that Medicare integration.
Lifts the load off the patient of all that additional administration and back and forth, and just seamlessly provides access to the services.
Correct.
That's
Yeah, so it basically reduces the load for patients as well as practitioners as well, and clinics, etc., where there's quite a lot of paperwork that you have to do in the background.
So we're going to go a little bit into the dark side now of lockdown. And we were one of the most locked down cities in the world, and really impacted people in a major way because everyone was thrown into a completely new situation that had unpredicted consequences and effects on people's mental health. What were your observations during that time? What did you see?
Yeah, so look, I think the impact of lockdown was quite severe from a mental health perspective. There were clinical studies now which suggest that, levels of anxiety, depression, went up quite significantly. A really major impact obviously was on people's, behaviors, routines that they would have, on a day-to-day basis, which suddenly had to change because of all the restrictions of lockdowns, and then people had to find new ways, right? But also what that meant is it started to reduce the social connectedness that people have with other people, and started to increase loneliness. So those are, some of the real sort of features that sort of impacted on mental health of people. And of course, there was a lot of uncertainty at the time. There was, job insecurity, financial stresses. So there were multiple pressures as a result of the lockdown. And so we're seeing the effects of that for people coming in even now because of lockdown-related sort of issues. Where I think the most significant level of impact has been with children. That's really where we see the real fallout of the impact of the lockdowns. And because of, the schools closing, shutting down, having, moving everything to online, what we've actually seen is that with children now, the levels of anxiety, depression much higher. Social anxiety has increased quite significantly. So children really have very limited resources available to them, or skills essentially, to interact and engage now socially. And internet addiction and gaming addiction has gone sky high. It's massive amongst children now as well.
And it was almost a double-edged sword, because you're changing all our habits when we went into lockdown. Then we lived like that for way too long. And then when lockdown was lifted, then we had to unlearn those habits and then learn new ones again. So it was kind of, if it didn't get you on the way going in, it was going to get you on the way coming out. So everyone's been impacted in random ways.
Yeah.
So I want to talk a little more about habits, and specifically habits for good or bad mental health. So what advice or observations do you have?
So, look, I think with the habits, there are obviously a number of bad habits. I mean, we can pick, things really very quickly, sleep-related sort of issues, bad sleeping habits. Procrastination is a big one that people generally tend to have. The alcohol and comfort eating, that's another really big bad habit that people generally tend to have. And what we find is that with a lot of these bad habits, generally there is an underlying emotional issue that is taking place with them, right? So there are either emotional issues or other sort of mental health conditions that are drivers for some of these particularly bad habits. And so what will happen over time is that initially they will start out as a bad habit or a coping mechanism, if you like, and then depending on how long it goes for and the level of severity around it, then it becomes the primary condition that you're trying to then deal with as well.
Becomes the go-to. Let's talk about procrastination, because I am a shocking procrastinator. In fact, I think we should do a podcast series just on procrastination alone. It's something I'm thinking about. So when I'm ready, I'll let you know.
Definitely, because I could talk about that for a couple of series.
Talk to me about some of what are the habits that are happening there that are kind of keeping us stuck in that state of procrastination.
Yeah, so look, procrastination, when you look at it, is really a behavior, right? So essentially it's something that you're not doing, right? You're avoiding doing. And so what we generally tend to find with procrastination as a behavior or a habit, if you like, is that there will usually be some kind of underlying psychological driver for the procrastination. And in a lot of instances, it's really anxiety. And the anxiety, which is an emotional state, leads to avoidance, which is essentially the behavior, okay? The underlying reason for that emotional state, the anxiety, is generally related to fear of failure or not meeting certain expectations. So people, who generally tend to procrastinate have very high internalized expectations, but the underlying mechanism, the cognitive process, is generally a fear of failure and having very high expectations.
So what advice could you give to would-be procrastinators out there?
Yeah, so what really you want to start to do is, first of all, you have to understand the underlying driver. So when you're talking about habits and starting to first understand bad habits and then learn how to develop good habits, what you really first have to understand is what is the underlying mechanism that is driving the habit, either the good habit or the bad habit, right? So once you start to understand that, then you've got a better capacity to start to work out what you need to do. So let's say if you look at procrastination, for example, once you understand that, okay, cognitively it might be fear of failure, it might be high expectations, etc. What you really want to be able to do is set up some very clear, specific goals on a day-to-day basis, right? So the goals that you set up then also have to be realistic. And this is what generally tends to happen with either procrastination and sometimes even around perfectionism, is that the goals that are set up are very unrealistic. And they're unrealistic because they are a compensatory mechanism for the fear of failure, right? So essentially, if you worry about failing, right, as a compensation, the mind then goes, oh, well, I better do X and do it really well, because then that way I'm not a failure, right? And so it sets up this really high target. But then what tends to happen is that it's actually self-sabotaging because it's so high, it's unrealistic that in effect you will fail. And so then you're back in the cycle and then you feel really bad, you become anxious again, and then you avoid doing it, right? So in order to avoid, first of all, the procrastination, you've got to understand what are the goals that you're setting, what are the expectations that you've got, and then make your goals more realistic. Once you make the goals realistic, then you need to break them down into achievable targets on a day-to-day basis, right? Because once you break them down into achievable targets, you can actually see it. You can then associate it with different types of reward mechanisms around, achieving it on a day-to-day basis. And once you keep doing that, then it becomes a more sustained habit and behavior, which can last for a longer period of time.
So much to talk about. I'm really struggling to stay on track here because we will have to bring you back for another episode for sure. Just before we finish up, I wanted to talk about thoughts, sort of that inner voice, and perhaps thoughts that are negative or that we're not even conscious of. We say things to ourselves on a daily basis that then affect our mood or our mental state. How do we change that? Is it possible to change that?
Well, it is, absolutely. And, one of the elements associated with the type of therapy that is done, cognitive behavior therapy, does exactly that. That's really the underlying basis and model of CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, which is really trying to understand your thoughts, your feelings, and your behaviors. And with your thoughts, as you rightly mentioned, the problem that we have is that a lot of the thoughts are automatic. So we feel like they're subconscious, but that's because they're automatic thoughts, right? We've been doing it for so long or thinking in that way for so long that that's just your default position in terms of your thinking. And so what we try and do in the course of therapy is to really start to understand that thought process. Most people will come in therapy and they want to change the behavior because the behavior is what you can see, right? And you can understand it. It's more tangible, right? The thoughts are not, right? So when you're focused on the behavior and you don't understand what is driving the behavior, you can't change the behavior. It's not possible. So you actually have to go back and understand the thought process. Those are the ones that are constantly driving the behavior as a result. So in terms of actually understanding your thought process, one of the things that I tell people to kind of keep a diary, right, of just your thoughts on a day-to-day basis around kind of, what are you doing? How do you feel? What makes you feel emotional about different things? And then what is the thought process that is linked to that? Once you start to understand that, what you start to see is there's a pattern in your thinking. And once you understand that pattern, then you have control.
So we're looking at it, most people go about it the wrong way. They're trying to change the behaviors, but not understanding that the behaviors are coming from the thoughts.
That's correct.
So you need to start there first. And the patterns, as you said, because we're being triggered on a daily basis. We tend to do the same things in a ritualistic way. So it's understanding what rituals are triggering what I guess, behaviors and responses and then working backwards from there.
That's right. So, as an example, we have a term that we use called SUDS, or seemingly unimportant decisions, right? And so what SUDS is, it's kind of like a decision that you're making that you don't think really has any bearing on anything, but it does in the scheme of things, depending. So, for example, let's take an alcoholic. They're not drinking anymore. They don't have the alcohol there. They've been really, really good. And so one day, the person says, okay, you know what, I'm just going to go walk down this park, right, that they haven't been going down for quite a while. So they walk down the park. As they're walking down on the other side of the park, there's a pub over there, and they're passing the pub. And obviously, that's a risk factor for someone who's an alcoholic. Now, so they're passing the pub, and then they realize, I didn't bring my cigarettes with me, right? So I might just sort of pop in and go and buy some cigarettes. So they go in to buy the cigarettes at the pub. So another seemingly unimportant decision. And they go to the vending machine, realize they don't have, the change required. So they go to the bar
to break the 20.
To break the 20 to try and buy the cigarettes. And, they go over there. Well, we can't give you change. You got to buy something.
What should I buy? Just
there we go. And that's your slippery slope. So you buy a drink, and then before you know it, you've ended up just sitting there the whole day. So, those are the seemingly unimportant decisions that, on a day-to-day basis we might be making. We don't realize we're doing this when it's leading to, particularly bad habits, bad behaviors that we're engaged in. And we're doing it all the time, but we don't realize. So when you're in therapy, this is the kind of stuff that you actually start to uncover and start to understand as to what is going on. Why are you, in fact, doing the things that you're doing? Because it's always guided by different thoughts and different emotions, your behaviors, right? And once you unpack that, then you have much better control over the behavior.
And the other thing is the metaphor of compounding. So something little that you're doing every day, you may not see the change of it in real time, but keep doing that same thing over and over again. In a year, 2 years, 3 years, you look back, it's only then that you see the evidence manifested of that small little thing that you're doing. And this is something that I want to talk about in all my episodes, and why I started this series is to just introduce this concept of you're not seeing the real impact today of things that you're doing. You're only going to see it in several years down the track, which is what you were talking about earlier on, that our habits or the way that we think it often starts, way back from in childhood or much, much earlier on than we realize.
Well, that's right. So there are certain patterns of behavior that are embedded much earlier on, which you will carry obviously into adolescence and then adulthood. And so to overcome that, this is exactly why I work with clients then to try and help them to understand what their goals are. So, again, when you're trying to change, particular habits, why are you trying to change a habit? So let's say, for example, if it's smoking, right, you want to quit smoking, all right. Well, why are you smoking in the first place? Why do you want to quit smoking? What's the context in which you continue to smoke, right? So once you start to kind of unpack that, then you've got a better sense of what to do. The other issue then is that the analogy I draw, it's kind of like, it's like a pincushion, right? So if you've got a pincushion, right, with all these, pins in it, and then you take the pins away, what's left?
The cushion with the
cushion with the holes in it, right? Okay. And so what happens is that, well, then you're going to have to fill it up because that's the purpose of it. So when you're looking at some of these bad habits and we say, oh, we've got to take it away, to, stop smoking, stop drinking, stop gambling, right? So
what do I do with my hands now? I'm smoking.
That's right. And so the question is, well, if you don't smoke, then what are you doing? Because there's a particular, pattern of behavior that's embedded around the smoking that you've developed. So if you take it away, then what are you going to do? What's going to happen? So what you actually then have to do is you've got to figure out what is it that you want to replace it with, right? What are the positive behaviors that you want to replace it with? And then you have to identify those positive behaviors, set up a goal, set up a structure, and then work backwards to go, all right, what do I need to do every single day to achieve that goal, right? So there's quite a bit of work that's sort of embedded in trying to change the habit. And what I often tell people is that you can't focus on the behavior to change the behavior.
The behavior is the outcome. It's not the source of
That's
the...
correct.
Yeah,
That's
very
correct.
interesting.
Yeah.
So, Dr. Q, the last section of our chat, I would like to talk about some recommendations or tips that you have for people who perhaps want to improve their mental health. What advice do you have?
Well, just quite simply, I've got sort of the ABCs of, mental health. And the first, the A is to really act with purpose every single day. What you need to do is make a plan, learn how to execute the plan on a daily basis, and then just work on that. The B, I would say, is have a sense of belonging. And that belonging means that what you want to be able to do is really find your community and then be engaged within that community in whatever way it is, right? If it's a sport that you're playing, engaged in some kind of charity work within your sort of local organization, etc. But to have a sense of being connected to your local community is very important. And finally, the C is to be committed. And when I talk about, commitment, it's sort of being committed to the plans and the goals that you have set by being purposeful about the habits that you develop.
Wonderful. Great. Fantastic advice. Thank you. Thank you so much for your time. Really enjoyed chatting with you. We will definitely have you back for more, so much more to talk about. So, yes, don't go too far away. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Shireen.
To understand what you are doing, you need to start by understanding why you are doing it. Once you've unpacked that, you have a much better chance of controlling your behavior. Dr. Qusai Hussain touched on so many aspects of good mental health, but there is so much more to explore. So no doubt, Dr. Q will be back with me in the future to record some more episodes. You've been listening to For Your Life podcast, produced by Sound Cartel. Subscribe free to For Your Life wherever you're listening now.